This episode of Mr. Hutchings History is now streaming on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, and all your favorite platforms like Castbox, Podcast Addict, and Amazon Music. Tune in now.
Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
Hi, and welcome back. This is my third installment of five on my total theme of waves of change, immigration, and migration in the United States. So, in today's podcast, I'm going to focus on forced migration, and the focus will be Native American displacement in the 19th century. And while the United States was expanding its borders and welcoming millions of immigrants, the U.S. federal government was simultaneously displacing indigenous peoples, pushing these indigenous people off their ancestral lands in a series of violent and unjust policies. This episode will focus on the Indian Removal Act, the Trail of Tears, and the broader context of Native American displacement. We'll examine the justification used by policymakers, the resistance mounted by Native communities, and the long-term implication of these actions. Through this discussion, we aim to understand how these events shaped both Native American history and the broader trajectory of U.S. expansion. So let me begin by introducing the context of forced migration. By the early 19th century, the United States was expanding rapidly. The Louisiana Purchase of 1803 had doubled the nation's size, and westward migration was driven by the promise of land and economic opportunity. This expansion, however, came at a significant cost to the Native American tribes, many of whom who had lived on these lands for centuries. Key to understanding forced migration is the role of the five civilized tribes, and these tribes would be the Creek, Choctaw, Chickasaw, Cherokee, and Seminole. These tribes had adopted many aspects of European American culture, including agricultural practices, written languages, and even constitutions. Many of them had even built cities themselves, which were very similar to the other American white majority cities. It was their effort to coexist with the settlers in this new United States. Despite the efforts of the five civilized tribes, they were still viewed as obstacles to American progress, particularly as cotton farming became central to the southern economy in the United States, where these five civilized tribes also happened to live. So let's begin with the Indian Removal Act of 1830. The Indian Removal Act was signed into law by President Andrew Jackson in 1830. This authorized the federal government to negotiate treaties with Native American tribes, exchanging Indian lands in the southeast United States for lands west of the Mississippi River. There were two goals of this act: economic expansion of the United States and territorial consolidation. Let's begin with economic expansion. Southern settlers, particularly plantation owners, coveted the fertile lands of the southeast that these Indians were on. The lands that these were on were seen as ideal for cotton cultivation. And the second goal of the act was territorial consolidation. The U.S. government sought to consolidate control over territories where Native tribes still had sovereignty. At this point in the young American nation, there was very little interest of having semi-sovereign entities within the new American borders. There was Andrew Jackson's role, his rhetoric. Jackson claimed that removal was a benevolent policy meant to protect Native Americans from extinction by relocating Native Americans to lands where they could live undisturbed. However, his speeches were often revealed to have underlying economic and racial motivations to move these Indians outside of the United States. Andrew Jackson also had a role in pushing this legislation. Jackson lobbied Congress heavily for the passage of the Indian Removal Act, framing the act as a measure of progress and national unity. There was, of course, resistance from the tribes. Many tribes resisted removal, both through negotiation and through legal action. The Cherokee Nation, in particular, used the American legal system to assert their own rights. This culminated in the landmark Supreme Court case Worcester versus Georgia, or Worcester versus Georgia of 1832. Okay, in Worcester versus Georgia, Chief Justice John Marshall ruled that the Cherokee Nation was a distinct political community and that Georgia's attempt to impose state law on Cherokee territory was therefore unconstitutional. There is a significance in this ruling. The decision theoretically upheld Cherokee sovereignty, protecting Cherokee lands from the encroachment of a U.S. state, particularly Georgia. Andrew Jackson was quite defiant about this. Jackson refused to enforce the ruling, reportedly saying, "John Marshall has made his decision, now let him enforce it." Of course, this reveals the fact that the legal system in the United States does not have a police force where the president has a military. Andrew Jackson's defiance highlighted the federal government's disregard for legal protections when economic and political interests were at stake. Let's move to the Trail of Tears. And the Trail of Tears is given a 2-year frame, 1838 to 1839. The most infamous consequence of the Indian Removal Act was this Trail of Tears. It is the forced relocation of the Cherokee Nation from Georgia to Indian Territory, which this Indian Territory is now the state of Oklahoma. So let's get some details of this march of the Trail of Tears. The scale of it was approximately 15,000 Cherokees who were forcibly removed by federal troops. And the conditions of the march covered about 1,000 miles, often through harsh winter weather. And there was casualties. An estimated 4,000 Cherokee died from disease, starvation, and exposure to the weather. The personal accounts include eyewitnesses which describe scenes of unimaginable suffering. These families were separated, and many were forced to leave behind possessions, homes, and of course their sacred sites. These first-hand accounts provide crucial evidence of the human cost of U.S. expansion. There were the Seminole Wars from 1817 to 1858, a time of almost 40 years. I think my math is 41 years. The Seminoles were a tribe in Florida which resisted removal more aggressively than other tribes, which led to 3 distinct conflicts, and essentially the First Seminole War, the Second Seminole War, and the Third Seminole War. Let me break this down a little bit. So in the First Seminole War goes from 1878 to 1818, and this was led by Andrew Jackson. The U.S. forces invaded Spanish Florida to suppress Seminole resistance and capture runaway enslaved people who had sought refuge among the Seminoles when they ran from their slave masters in the southern United States. There was the Second Seminole War, and this is from 1835 to 1842. This was the most prolonged and costly conflict, with Seminoles using guerrilla tactics to resist removal. Despite the resilience of the Seminoles, many were eventually forced westward. And finally, the Third Seminole War from 1855 to 1858. This final effort to remove the remaining Seminoles, leaving only a small population in the Florida Everglades. So let's get some perspectives and understand some justifications. So there was Andrew Jackson's justifications. and Jackson framed removal as a humanitarian policy. He claimed that Native Americans could not coexist with settlers and would face extinction if they remained. There was also some economic motivations behind this. The white settlers desired native lands for agricultural development, particularly for cotton plantations, which depended on enslaved labor. And quite simply, these Indian lands were in the way of profit. So, some historical perspectives. The traditional view, they see this that these older histories are often framed as removal as a necessary step for national progress. There's the revisionist perspective. Scholars like D. Brown in the book Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee argue that removal was a deliberate act of ethnic cleansing driven by greed and racial superiority. There is an economic analysis used by historians, and some historians highlight the link between native displacement and the rise of the American economy. And these economic historians emphasize how land acquisition fueled agricultural and industrial growth, and simply anybody who is anyone could not have stood in the way of the growing American economic behemoth. And in this particular case, or in this instance, it was just Native Americans in the way. And as other groups would stand in the way of growth and profit, they would too would be confronted by the US government. Probably something that can be applied to environmentalists at different times in American history. So never forget the role of economics in history. There were long-term consequences to the forced displacement of Native Americans. Three I'm going to touch on is cultural loss, generational trauma, and policy precedents. For cultural loss, displacement severed native tribes from their ancestral lands, disrupting cultural practices tied to these places. The generational trauma, the psychological and emotional toll of forced migration has persisted across generations, contributing to systematic challenges faced by many native communities today. And finally, policy precedents. The Indian Removal Act set a precedent for future policies that marginalized Native Americans, including the reservation system and later assimilation efforts, such as boarding schools. The forced migration of Native Americans in the 19th century exposes the deep contradictions in U.S. history, a nation founded on ideals of liberty and justice that simultaneously enacted policies of displacement and dispossession. So, as we wrap up, I'd like you to consider these questions. First, how did the removal of Native Americans conflict with the ideals of freedom and justice outlined in the U.S. Constitution? Secondly, what role did economic motivations play in shaping policies like the Indian Removal Act? And thirdly, how might the forced displacement of Native Americans inform our understanding of other forms of forced migrations throughout history? Well, thank you for joining me today on Mr. Hutchings History. In our next episode, we'll explore the rise of restrictive immigration policies in the late 19th century and their impact on American identity. Until next time, keep questioning and keep learning.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.